Well, I tell you, the challenge comes in when you transition between the public space and the private space. And so when you look across the city, there's a lot of the infrastructure that is owned and managed and controlled and run by the city itself. But even in the subway, you've got, city stakeholders, public, it's a public infrastructure.
Right.
And so
in New York, it's a state infrastructure in a city environment, so it's complicated.
But you're always going to have that challenge when you cross over into privately owned facilities.
Exactly right.
And even, when you talk about real estate investment trusts, they account for a small percentage of the ownership of the real estate. So privately held real estate, and especially in New York City, a lot of privately held real estate. And as soon as you cross that line between public and private, you just run into a quagmire of problems in terms of who owns the infrastructure, and if it breaks, who's responsible for it, and what's the quality of service guarantees, and blah, blah, blah. And so at events like this, when we're talking about smart cities, we have to bring that conversation full circle. We have to talk about what's the relationship between the public sector and the private sector in terms of creating that universal infrastructure, that ubiquitous communications platform that they can both ride on. Right. And that's the internet.
Yeah, and it's one of the most interesting things about smart cities, and one of the things I thought was so encouraging about the discussion this morning is you had public sector officials and city employees, federal staff, leadership saying, yes, absolutely, you're right. This is going to be really messy, and this is the future. We're willing to think long term about this, as opposed to historically, you've had the private sector innovating, doing their thing over here, and then trying to retrofit into cities and states and federal government issues, and it's just a logjam. And this, I'm maybe Pollyanna, but I think it's an opportunity to really kind of talk about unique partnerships. Do you think that's too optimistic, or is it possible?
I think you're right. That's what I got out of the keynotes this morning, was a positive attitude, and you said it earlier, where not elected officials, but from White House, telecommunications, senior telecom people, all of that, admit it. Government gets in the way, sure. And they've created this global cities innovation initiative. I can't remember the acronym, but they started the initiative in December, and they're going to be awarding in 2 weeks.
Yeah,
and so actually, that's pretty impressive.
The cool thing about that is Austin's one of the final, I think, final seven or so.
6 or 7.
Pardon me?
Final 7.
7, that's what I thought. And we've kind of gotten it down. So it's interesting. And both Chelsea and I are here locally. I spent 25 years in New York City. I think one of the things that's interesting is to think about this problem at scale, but then think about how can we bring it down to smaller cities, and how do we effectively